Hi, friends. Welcome back. This is episode 3 of our series on Christian Zionism. In this episode, I have a conversation with Daniel Hummel. Daniel is the director of the Lumen Center in Madison, Wisconsin, and a research fellow in the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also the author of 2 books that are significant for us here. The first one, published in 2019, Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S.-Israeli Relations, and most recently, in 2023, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. In the conversation, we discuss dispensationalism and its relationship to Christian Zionism, but also the waning power of dispensationalism over Christian Zionism and the growth of more of a prosperity Pentecostal way of Christian Zionism that has become dominant today. And has been very influential in shaping American politics, relationship with Israeli officials, and all the way till today, and the pervasive influence and power of Christian Zionism over American politics and American foreign policy. This is a really important conversation, and it kind of follows the previous 2 conversations we had, one with Robert Smith about the roots of Christian Zionism, and also with Stephen Sizer about 19th century and 20th century dispensationalism and the rise of Christian Zionism in Britain and the US. The conversations here are very important for us to understand and to unpack the roots and the histories and the theologies of Christian Zionism, especially since how much that history influences the way that Christian Zionism functions today in different ways, shapes, and forms. For our Patreon supporters, we continue the conversation, and I ask him a question about Palestinians and how do Palestinians fit into Christian Zionism, whether as they were imagined or how they have been rendered invisible in how Christian Zionists thought and continue to think about their political activism and their theology. So here it is, my conversation with Daniel Hummel. Hi, Dan Hummel. Welcome to Across the Divide.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Dan. So just for the audience, you and I were on a webinar recently discussing Christianity Today. I've always known of you. Well, by always, I mean over the last year. And I was like, oh, wow, this is Dan Hummel. This is a big deal for me. So let me be in the webinar with him. And then after I see you face to face, I could reach out to you about being on the podcast with us. So I'm so glad you're here. I learned a lot from your work on Covenant Brothers and how you understand evangelicals and Israel and US policy. So I think this conversation is really important, I think, for me personally, but also for our listeners to understand the influence and power and also the history of Christian Zionism. So I'm very excited about this conversation. Just to kick off our conversation for the audience, can you tell us more about yourself and how you got interested in these kind of conversations?
Sure. And Daniel, I recognized you from, we both were on the New Evangelicals podcast. That was probably November or so. We weren't together on it, so it's not like you're forgetting a whole conversation we had, but we were both guests on subsequent episodes of that podcast as well. So I recognized you from that. But so I'm talking to you from Madison, Wisconsin. I moved here in 2010 to get my PhD in American history, and I've stayed. I've had a few stints outside of Madison, but so I'm a historian by training. I did my PhD in American religious and diplomatic history, looking at the history of the Christian Zionist movement since 1948, really, and looking at it from an archival perspective. That's what historians tend to do. You go into the archives, things that aren't published, things that at one point were classified. And my twist on that was I went into the Israeli state archives, and I learned enough modern Hebrew here at UW to be able to read the Hebrew documents. And so part of what I was trying to do was reconstruct a history of how the Israeli state understood American Christianity and ended up making some really strategic choices on their part to cultivate a very close relationship with particularly evangelical Christians. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that part of history and framing it in the things I learned in my PhD program about the Cold War, about religion in American society, about decolonization, and other big themes like that. But after that dissertation, that turned into a book called Covenant Brothers, and then I wrote a book more recently on the history of dispensationalism, which is a particular theological tradition that I'm sure we'll talk a bit about. That plays into a lot of dispensationalists are also Christian Zionists. Because of their theological commitments, they have a very elevated view of the modern state of Israel, and yet that the history of dispensationalism isn't just about Christian Zionism. So I wanted to sort of go into a longer history of that. Beyond sort of what I write about, I work at a place called the Lumen Center here in Madison. It's funded by the Stephen and Laura Brown Foundation, and it's a Christian. It's new. We just started, but it's a Christian center for research and scholarship, trying to engage UW-Madison on all types of topics where we think Christian scholars have something interesting to contribute to the conversation. I'm also an evangelical Christian. I'm happy to sort of take that term, even though it's quite a hot debated term right now. And certainly in a place like Madison, you have to really clarify exactly what you mean when you say you're an evangelical Christian. But I grew up as a missionary kid. I lived in Germany for many years. My dad worked for a mission for most of my childhood. And I ended up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is not that surprising if you know sort of American evangelical missions. There's a lot of them that are headquartered in that area. So I grew up really living and breathing, white American evangelicalism. I ended up, one very small claim to fame related to dispensationalism is I went to the same mega church, and it was a very, very big church, as Jerry Jenkins, who's one of the co-authors of the Left Behind novels.
That's right. Yeah.
I never actually talked to him personally or anything, but we definitely all knew in the church that he went there. There was a lot of sort of recognizing of him, but that's sort of the culture I grew up in, and I didn't really get out of that subculture until I went to college at Colorado State University, which is a very diverse, pluralistic state university, and ended up. Some people react that way and they deconstruct or they really, rethink things. I just got very intellectual about it and wanted to understand sort of if what I thought wasn't what everyone thought, well, then what did everyone else think and how can I understand that in relation to my own upbringing? And of course, I've changed since then in my my Christian beliefs, like most people would. But I still call myself an evangelical, and part of my interest in these topics is that I really care about the community that I'm a part of, and I want to see better theology, better engagement with the world going forward than what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I love that. Why did you move away from dispensational, kind of that rapture and theology? It seems to me that it's a very powerful theology and kind of creates kind of very solid following. Like, what happened to you personally that made you kind of step away from that?
Yeah, I think part of it is it never really took strong hold. It never animated my faith when I was a kid. It was just sort of what you grew up with, and so I never really thought deeply about it, to be honest with you, until I was in college. I ended up going to a college-oriented church that was not particularly dispensationalist. I'm sure there were some people there who had that type of theology, but I ended up, really. You could say, though I count myself a Christian since I was a sort of an 8-year-old, 7-year-old. I really wasn't intellectually engaged until college. And the people I ended up reading, very typical list for American evangelicals, people like C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and others. None of them were dispensationalist. And I ended up at some point, moving toward tackling some of the more core issues around dispensationalism. And ultimately, it was very intellectual. It's like, I just don't think this is the right way to interpret the Bible. I mean, that was the first thing. It wasn't sort of out of a particular issue or social issue or anything like that. It was just recognizing, at least from my perspective, the lack of intellectual rigor that I saw in the dispensationalist theology versus other things on offer. As I studied it more, I came to really have a strong issue with dispensationalism's treatment of the church Israel distinction, as it's called, but understanding that there are these sort of two separate covenants or two chosen peoples that dispensationalists believe God has. I thought that was a really, I thought it was wrong way to read the Bible, but also had really potentially problematic side effects or effects of that reading. And we'll get into that. That's part of what how dispensationalism contributes to Christian Zionism is its particular reading of what the nation of Israel is in the biblical story and how that differs from, frankly, almost every other Christian tradition we know of, whether that's Catholic or Orthodox or the majority of Protestant traditions don't have this same reading. So I also, my friend group, I mean, this is like a very sociological explanation, but my friend group didn't have many dispensationalists in it. There were many of us were Christians or in college, sort of were Christians and are trying to figure out if that's still part of what you wanted to be. But I didn't hang out with people based on their theological sort of background. And so once you sort of get socialized into a Christian community where the particularities of this theology don't sort of come to the fore a lot, you start seeing the insufficiency of them, or sort of the way that's just not how I want to identify as a Christian. So that being said, I have family and friends who would count themselves still part of dispensationalism in the sense if you listed the sort of beliefs that follow, they would say yes. Though I don't know if any of them would say identify as a dispensationalist. So I still have very close relationships with people who believe some of the things I disagree with, and I always think about that when I'm talking about it as well. I don't want to sort of entirely alienate people, even while sort of articulating the disagreements and the ways that this theology has had some pretty ill effects in the way evangelicals have been witnessing in the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have so many things in common, by the way. So I'm also a missionary kid. And I also got to read Schaeffer and Lewis in college. I was attending a Christian study center called the Gainesville Christian Study Center at the University of Florida. And that's how I got into all of that work, the kind of theological, philosophical work of Christianity in that university setting. But also, there's that kind of element of diversity, while being in a secular space, but also being among other Christians from different backgrounds really challenges that kind of bubble mentality that I had about my faith. And it's like, wait, actually what I think is true is actually not really true. Or maybe there's something more compelling in other understandings of the faith. That's really fun. But also I have family members from my wife's side of the family that is just default dispensationalist, and rapture theology is a big thing, and so on. But anyway, so let's deal with this. How do you understand dispensationalism? And you mentioned this earlier, that it contributes to Christian Zionism. Mm-hmm. So how do you define both, and how do you see the connection between them?
Yeah, so I'll just go straight to the theology first. So if you just were trying to define what is dispensationalism as a theological system, what are its claims? There's really three of the three most important are a church Israel distinction. I mentioned that before, but the idea that what the story of the Bible is of God working through the people of Israel, that most Christians would agree with that, at least through the Old Testament. But that what happens in the New Testament, or what happens after the life and ministry of Jesus, is that the church does not sort of encompass Israel, or does not, it's not widened to include Israel and Gentiles, but actually there's a church and Israel. And so there are two chosen peoples of God. And so this means that in the future, God will continue to work with the nation of Israel. And for many people today, that would be the modern state of Israel, though some, certainly before 1948, that was a topic of debate among dispensationalists was the Zionist movement actually prophetically significant, or was it not? But this distinction is really important, and it means, to go to the second thing, a more literalistic reading of prophecy. About a quarter of the whole Bible we count as prophetic books. You can think of the Old Testament prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Daniel. You can think of Revelation as being an apocalyptic prophetic book as well. And what dispensationalists do is they read these, we sometimes call it literally, though they're not actually reading it literally. They're reading it as if what is being talked about in symbolic language in those books will have a sort of historical, physical manifestation in a way that you can sort of correlate the symbols to direct things happening on Earth. So if there are, dragons with 7 heads or something like that, dispensationalists don't read that literally as if there is a literal dragon with 7 heads, but they think that dragon represents some type of coalition of 7 nations or something like that, and that it will happen in observable space-time. Whereas plenty of other traditions read that type of language as entirely symbolic, as something that is either talking about sort of spiritual realities. Some people think it's referencing, things that happened in the 1st or 2nd century. That is really what is being symbolized there. For dispensationalists, it's a futurist, literal reading of prophecy, and so this is distinct, and this combines with the Church-Israel distinction to mean much of the prophetic parts of the Bible talk about Israel, or they talk about the sort of nation of Israel. Certainly the Old Testament prophets are focused on that a lot. And so when dispensationalists read those passages, they think these will be sort of literally in space-time in the future fulfilled with the Jewish people, the sort of ethnic seed of Abraham, whatever you want to call it. And so today they see that as the modern state of Israel. These two things then go to what actually the word comes from, dispensationalism. So in order to sort of make this type of reading of the Bible cohere, dispensationalists divide the biblical story into multiple time periods. They call dispensations, a period of time or an economy of God, as the dictionary definition would say it. And so with certain dispensations, God is working with the Jewish people or the people of Israel, and then in another dispensation, the current dispensation, God is primarily working through the church or the sort of Gentile people. And if you sort of apply this filter on the Bible, and if you say there's a church-Israel distinction, there's a certain way to read futurist prophecy through that distinction, and depending on where you're reading in the Bible, you need to remember what dispensation you're in. You develop sort of the many, many commitments that dispensationalists have to certain interpretations of different parts of the Bible. And so that's really what's going on here. In each of these, there are variations within dispensationalism. There's not one single way to do it. They debate over how many dispensations they are. The church-Israel distinction is pretty rock solid. That's something that all dispensationalists share. But even the interpretation of prophecy, of course, there's debates over exactly what these actual historical sort of manifestations of prophecy will be. As you can imagine, before the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of emphasis on the Soviet Union as being a major player. Cold War ends, a lot of reinterpretation has to happen to sort of accommodate what's happening in the world as well. And this could be one of the critiques of dispensationalism, is that because it is futurist and it sees this sort of historical fulfillment of prophecy, it tends to be quite swayed by the moment on what actually dispensations are saying are going to happen. So there's constant revisions, constant sort of having to backtrack things that were said before, and that's a big part of the tradition as well. So that's a theological sort of way to think about it. Historically, and this is probably the most important thing, is it's not that old of a tradition. So we tend to trace the core parts of this belief system to the 19th century, to the 1830s really is when we really see, at least in print, this type of teaching emerging slowly, but different parts of it. And it's sort of founder is a guy named John Nelson Darby, who was the founder of the Plymouth Brethren movement, a very small, numerically speaking, dissenter movement in the UK. And Darby was a very charismatic figure. He wrote a lot. He organized a lot in the dissenter part of Protestantism. And he was one of the people who really developed some of the core ideas here, including the Church-Israel distinction. I should say some of probably the most well-known part of dispensationalism is this idea of an any moment rapture, or the idea that really at this moment, a moment from now, all the true Christians will be whisked away to heaven, and that'll kick off this end time scenario that dispensationalists believe the prophetic books tell them about. That idea of an any moment rapture is, as far as we can tell, really Darby's invention, or he was the one who brought this to life in a way where he put it at the core of what he was teaching about Christians should hope for in the future. And it all flowed through these other commitments. So the reason the rapture has to happen is because God has to take away the church from the earth so that he can work with the nation of Israel again in sort of a more direct way. And so the rapture really for someone like Darby is just like a cog in this bigger system. And so Darby is really the progenitor of a lot of these ideas, though they get changed and adapted a lot once Americans, about 50 years later in the 1880s, 1890s, really pick them up in full force. And this is what the Dispensationalism book is a lot about, but how this really fringe system of theology becomes a mainstream system of theology that then gets popularized and very simplified down into what at least a generation ago, at least half of American evangelicals sort of just took to be the default way to think about theology in the Bible. And anyway, that's the story of the popularization of dispensationalism. But it is both a theology that has sort of propositions to it. It's also a history and a culture that produces certain types of people who grow up in it and inhabit its ideas.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
And theologically, dispensationalism has lost a lot of credibility. Most seminaries and theology departments do not take it seriously. You still have kind of the hallmarks of dispensational thinking in Dallas Theological Seminary and otherwise. But for the most part, most evangelicals, and of course the vast majority of Christians, reject that theology. But there's a cultural element that remains, the kind of the left behind and this kind of doomsday kind of theological scenarios that kind of persist in the culture, especially among kind of the average evangelical who hasn't really done a whole lot of work and reading and understanding the scripture. But in many ways, kind of that left behind legacy is left behind in a way that it still persists in many conservative evangelical circles. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, that's right. And I talk about that as a pop dispensationalism. So this popularized version that really manifests in consumer Christian culture, in television ministry, sort of televangelism and other areas, in fiction, in sort of Christian fiction. This is still quite popular, though even there it's on the decline with younger evangelicals. There's definitely a generational gap there. But yeah, I don't want to minimize the importance of the popularized version to particularly the last sort of 40 years, I'd say, of evangelical politics and evangelical culture, popular culture. It's had a very significant effect. And while it is a simplified, you could even say dumbed down version of the systematic theology, it's indebted to the actual seminary system that a few generations ago had a lot more dispensationalists in it as well. So there's an interesting way where over time you can see how ideas that really are hatched in much more sort of academic spaces do filter down into the popular culture. And then even if the academic spaces move on to a different way of thinking, the culture takes a much longer time to adapt to that and sort of absorb new ideas, particularly if the newer ideas aren't nearly as interesting and sort of marketable as the old ideas are.
And also they have a lot of money, right, and power. Specifically, I mean, I'm thinking of the late Pat Robertson had a huge influence on, the 500 Club, had a huge influence. It's not like Kirk Cameron and Nicolas Cage were that influential in the movies, but for those writings to make it to a mainstream pop culture, it says something about it. So there is a persisting, nagging kind of influence, but also televangelists and so on who have an oversized platform. And so their dispensational thinking is going to persist and continue in many ways in the form of Christian Zionism. And that's kind of because this is kind of where you have an interesting argument, and we can talk about it, which is that you minimize the role of dispensationalism in Christian Zionism today, while we still would acknowledge that it's still significant in the formation of the Christian right. So anyway, let's kind of pivot to Christian Zionism then from that. Like, how do you define Christian Zionism without dispensationalism, and what role does it play in the formation of Christian Zionist advocacy and also theology?
Yeah. Well, just to answer the last part first, just quickly, the reason dispensationalism is much less important today to explain Christian Zionism is largely because of the Pentecostalization of Christian Zionism and the globalization of Christian Zionism. And both of those processes have meant that the dispensational sort of impetus has been overshadowed by other things happening, even as there are people within the movement still that are dispensationalists. If you go back to, say, 50, 60 years ago, the majority of leaders of Christian Zionism were American dispensationalists. And that's just not true anymore. And so that we can get to sort of what changes later. But I try to have a very simple definition of Christian Zionism that would include that is not sort of dependent on dispensationalism, because of course there's other types of Christian Zionists. I listened to your intro to this series. You mentioned that there's Catholic Christian Zionists, or Catholic Zionists, I guess you'd call them. There's mainline Protestant Zionists as well. There's also a variety of different types of evangelical Christian Zionists. And so as a sort of baseline argument or baseline definition, I would say Christian Zionism is any argument for a national state of Israel that relies on Christian theological arguments. And so there there's all types of Christian theological arguments you can invoke. It does mean Zionism is different than other types of nationalism. Most people don't, certainly most Americans don't have, sort of theological arguments for why there needs to be a state of India or a state of China. But they do have arguments for why there needs to be a state of Israel. And that's what I wanted to sort of identify as what is special about this particular entity, these particular people that has drawn Christians. And I've already mentioned a bit about why dispensationalists might be interested in the Jewish people or in modern Zionism. But just state it again, when Zionism emerged in the late 19th century, the people who were more dispensationalist leaning tended to see this as a fulfillment of prophecy. They tended to read the prophetic, particularly the chapters in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, about the so-called regathering of God's, sort of chosen people, covenanted people. And they saw this as a future event. So this wasn't sort of a reference to something that happened back in the ancient world. This was a regathering that had yet to be fulfilled. And that this regathering would be a preliminary event to the second coming. And that is what really drove interest in the Zionist movement in the late 19th century. And that developed into a fascination by dispensationalists and people who were close to dispensationalists in the Zionist movement. And now I mentioned there's a lot of debate, because what a dispensationalist in the 19th century would have expected, they would have expected religious Jews to be moving back to their homeland and then establishing something that would look like a sort of theocracy, or sort of a remaking of the ancient Israelite kingdom, where there would be a temple and there would be sort of all the trappings of a stereotypically, you could say, biblical Israel. And that was not what the Zionist movement was about. The Zionist movement was largely secular Jews working in sort of the imperial system of the early 20th century. Many of them were socialists or flirted with socialism, the kibbutz movement being an example of that. And so this did not look like what Christian Zionists at the time were expecting. And so there was a lot of debate over, is this like a false fulfillment of prophecy? Is there some mysterious way that all these secular Jews are going to convert and become Orthodox or even Christian before there's a state? 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel sort of moves all that to the side. And most dispensationalists just agree, essentially, that if they misread it, they misread prophecy, and this State of Israel that was founded is is the state of Israel that was promised through prophecy. So the dispensationalist fixation on prophecy sort of separates them from other types of Christians who also support Israel. If you think of more mainline Protestants, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr was a very important mid-20th century supporter of Zionism. Niebuhr did not believe in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy in any sort of literal way. He had a lot of humanitarian, as he would call them, or ethical arguments for why he believed Jews needed a state in Palestine. And he would deploy those arguments much more readily than anything having to do with biblical prophecy.
And it's mostly because of that post-Holocaust kind of way of thinking, because out of Christian analysis of like, where was God, and like what's the solution for the Jewish problem moving forward, right?
That's right. And I mean, Niebuhr was ahead of this in the sense that he argued from the mid-1930s on that. And he was looking at, or probably earlier than the mid-1930s, but he was looking at European anti-Semitism and even going back to, pogroms in Russia and so forth, and making a sort of argument that there's something particularly problematic happening in the world against the Jewish people, and so that they deserve this. But he didn't invoke any type of sort of supernatural prophecy explanation. And so dispensationalists really do have a corner, you could say, on that type of fixation on the Zionist movement. Now, it's also important, though, I start the book Covenant Brothers, which tracks the history of this. I start after this period, in part because even through World War II, even through 1948, to be honest, there was not like a mass movement of evangelicals rallying around this cause, giving their money, voting on it, all that kind of stuff that we see today. It was a fixation of leaders mostly, and of people who sort of developed a particular interest in this. And those are important people like William Blackstone from the 19th century, very important figure. But Blackstone did not represent millions of people as the Christian Zionists today claim they represent. He represented really himself and some people that were close to him. And so one of the questions here is, there is various Christian Zionist theologies all through the last, you could say, 500 years since the Reformation. Most of them are seen as eccentric or the provenance of just a few people until we get to the 20th century, and largely until we get to evangelicals in the mid-20th century. And so that was, for me, a historical question, is like, what happens in the 1950s, 1960s to really activate evangelicals on a mass scale, to the point that by the 80s and 90s, we have leaders in the movement talking about representing, tens of millions of people who support more and more pro-Israel policies in the U.S. and are also doing other things, more cultural things, to show their support for Israel, to show their rejection of historic anti-Judaism that many Christians had up until the Holocaust. And that to me is a really interesting question, is how does this become a mass movement versus when do the ideas just emerge? Because that's a different story that doesn't have nearly as much political consequence.
All right. And I think you define it as Christian Zionism as reconciliation, as in trying to reconcile Jewish-Christian relations. And that means, you give the example of Billy Graham going to Israel in 1960, and he says, I'm not going to evangelize. I'm just going to visit, and Jesus is Jewish, and I'm here to support the Israeli state in a way. I don't think he said that explicitly, but I think it's obvious in what he was doing in 1960. And then it continues today to this, well, we're not going to evangelize Jews today. And also, we cannot be critical of Israel today. And I don't know how you see that, but there's this like, well, we have to support the Jewish people. And I think this idea of reconciliation, I think, still seems to be very operative and very influential, because this is a question I'm always asking as a Palestinian Christian. Well, why can't Christians in the West be critical of the Israeli policies against the Palestinians? And I want to talk with you about this later. But Palestinians are not significant in the way they do any of this work, theological or political. But it seems that this affection for the Jewish people, or this reconciliation, seems to be very influential in the way that they think. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that, or like how does that work itself out?
Yeah, I tried to be a bit provocative by saying reconciliation as well, because that's certainly not how Christian Zionism tends to be portrayed. It tends to be portrayed as actually the opposite, which is it's a covert evangelistic movement to try to And I also don't want to, in my writings and elsewhere, I document people where that's true. They were covert, trying to do something else. But the bulk of the movement is really about this post-Holocaust and dispensationalist inflected understanding of the compatibility or the symbiosis between Jews and Christians. And the other way that Christian Zionism tends to be portrayed is as an end times movement, like that there's this apocalyptic fascination. I think in part people from the outside want to portray it that way because those types of movements tend to burn out. There tends to be a sense that, well, when the apocalypse doesn't come, there will be a loss of energy. And if anything, I've seen the opposite development in Christian Zionism, which is year after year, there's more and more energy around this relationship. And so if nothing else, just to set people up for what I maybe unfortunately think is the future, is that there seems to be only growth happening right now in the appeal of Christian Zionism to Christians around the world. And that is not because it's apocalyptic. It's actually very long looking. It's looking into the future for a long time and trying to set up institutions and set up sort of relationships that are going to go long into the future. But that reconciliation metaphor, it was really important to me because, one, I was seeing it in the sources. So as I was going to some of these early 1950s, 1960s evangelicals who had moved to Israel or gotten to know Israelis in a sense of trying to build a proto political relationship, this idea of sort of Christians needing to apologize for the past, to distance themselves from virtually the main thrust of Christian theology for the first 1900 years of and by the way, I think there's a lot of problems in this theology, but the idea that God had cursed the Jews because they had rejected Jesus, that they were sort of condemned to wander the world because of that rejection. These are things that the Catholic Church denounced in Nostra Aetate, which is a statement into the Second Vatican Council. I mean, this is 1960. So between between Peter and 1960s, this is what the Catholic Church taught, and Protestants weren't much better on that either. And of course, you can see some of this really playing into Nazi ideology and so forth, into how they talked about the Jewish people in a largely Lutheran society in Nazi Germany. So there's a lot of this sense on the evangelical side that they need to either apologize for this history or distance themselves from it and say that's, we're dispensationalists. We don't believe that. And this is one thing, just sort of by the circumstances of history, dispensationalists come out of the Second World War, come out of the Holocaust, and come out of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, looking like they really do have some insights here, that they were saying that there'd be a state of Israel created sort of miraculously, and that the Jewish people still had a future, and they weren't just condemned to be sort of suffering for rejecting Jesus. So these things are really important, but they are at the core of what it meant for evangelicals to relate to Jewish people. And that to me is a really important part, because you really want to start understanding what is this as a political movement, this Christian Zionist movement. It's a movement that is like any other political movement. It's made up of organizations and institutions and relationships and money, and how these things work together for common cause. And that's a type of way of thinking about Christian Zionism that's much less about sort of the cultural memes or just the theology behind it. But what does it actually mean for institutions, evangelical institutions, to develop in a way to be able to relate to the state of Israel? And for me, the biggest part of that, beyond the theology and and even the American sort of culture, was this reconciliationist language that, and that's where the title of my first book is Covenant Brothers, which is not a term, is a term I heard at a big Christian Zionist event that was actually uttered by an Orthodox rabbi who was looking out over the crowd of Christian Zionists and saying, "You all are my covenant brothers." And I was just struck by how that term only makes sense within a very particular cultural context, where this reconciliation has really gone down the road pretty far, where you can actually call each other brothers, where for most of church history, these were seen as rivals, or one had superseded the other. And to hear an Orthodox rabbi say that was even more striking, because that is a tradition that tends to be within the Jewish world most skeptical of evangelical Christians. So, that reconciliation thing is really important, and it also is one of the organizing categories for how dispensationalism and other theological thinking gets filtered into the movement.
Yeah, I mean, and today you have Bibi Netanyahu saying, Israel has no better friends than the evangelicals. Right. The Israeli government has been working hard, and you know more about this since you've been doing the historical work as well. You talking about Begin and others who have been very strategic in working with Christian Zionists up till today as well. Before we talk about the shoots, what happened after 1967 when Israel took over the whole of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, I want to make sure that we're not going to miss this point, which is the centrality of Genesis 12:3 on Christian Zionism, because you're saying, end times dispensational eschatology isn't as significant as Genesis 12:3. You mentioned also the Pentecostalism and the globalization of Christian Zionism, and I'm hearing you saying Genesis 12:13, right? The prosperity gospel idea in Pentecostalism. So how do you anchor kind of Genesis 12:3, and how do you see it playing itself out in Christian Zionism and also in kind of the political activism of Christian Zionism?
Yeah, this is where the history is really important. So there are almost no, I don't want to overstate it. The bulk of the core of the institutional story has almost no Pentecostals in it until you get to the 1980s. And that has to do with the Christian right in the US and how the Christian right becomes a forum where a lot of different sub-traditions within the evangelical world start mixing: fundamentalists, evangelicals, Pentecostals. These are actually really important terms to understand if you're going to sort of theological arguments for supporting Israel. Each of those communities has different arguments that they deploy, based on their priors, based on their theology. And so in the early period from the 1940s to really the 1970s, we're really talking about evangelicals around the Billy Graham circle of people who were not Pentecostal. I mean, that was a really important dividing line for that community at that time. It's much more blurred now. Pentecostals hang out with evangelicals, who hang out with fundamentalists a lot more today. But once you get to the Pentecostalization of Christian Zionism, which really starts in the 70s and 80s with people like Pat Robertson, you mentioned him, someone who brings in a very vibrant sense of the Holy Spirit, it's sort of empowering people to do their work, expectation of speaking in tongues, all that kind of stuff that Pentecostals have. You start getting also the influence of the prosperity gospel, which tends to come out of a Pentecostal tradition, usually when you see it. And that's this idea that God really wants to bestow blessings on his followers. And that could be blessings of health, blessings of wealth, or if you push it, blessings for your country. And this is really where you start seeing how this fits into Christian Zionism, because the operative text for these Pentecostally informed Christian Zionists is God speaking to Abram in Genesis 12. And this is right at the beginning. This is when Abram is first introduced, basically, in the Bible. And God is telling him, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. And then the story goes on, but Pentecostal readers of this really see this as God explaining how he distributes blessings and curses to all peoples for all times. And there's some interpretive jumping that happens. So God is speaking to Abram turns into Abraham, the father of the people of Israel. And then you have ancient Israel. And for Pentecostals, this all is continuous with the modern state of Israel. So then when God is telling Abram, I will bless those who bless you, Pentecostals who are from this tradition read this today as God basically saying, I will bless those who bless the modern nation of Israel, and I will curse those who curse the modern nation of Israel. And so if that's what you believe, then it creates a very clear impetus for why you would want to support Israel in the contemporary geopolitical context, because this is how God will bless you and your country. And if you just sort of observe it as an ethnographer, these types of readings of Genesis 12:3 can be both individual. I was at a conference once when a Brazilian Pentecostal pastor, basically said, like, if you bless Israel right now with a gift to his organization or whatever, he said, I guarantee you within 90 days, God will bless you. And so there's like a personal, like, oh, okay, if, I have a healing, I have a illness, whatever, okay, I should do this. But then there's also the other version, which is, God will bless your nation. And so another example is I was talking to a South African politician, actually, who was very pro-Israel, had been in that mode for a long time, a Pentecostal person. And there had just been a deal done between South Africa and Israel about some irrigation system. Israel exports a lot of farm technology to African nations. This is part of its diplomacy. And anyway, this politician in his district, he was now going to get this irrigation system from Israel. And he saw this as a fulfillment of Genesis 12:3. Like, he supports Israel diplomatically. Israel sends its technology to his district, and therefore he's being blessed. And so you can read it both of those ways. But what's powerful about this reading is it, beyond the assumptions I've just talked about you basically equating Abram in Genesis 12 to the modern state of Israel, and assuming that God works this way, that God actually sort of like a transaction, God blesses those who bless Israel. If you just assume those things, nothing else really matters in terms of where you're coming from theologically. And so this is what can unite Christian Zionists that are from Nigeria or Brazil. Brazil's probably the largest, in terms of numbers, probably has the largest Christian Zionist population in the world right now, or the United States or Taiwan or South Korea, all places that have a strong Christian Zionist community. And they can all rally around this very, sort of positive, simple way of talking about what God is calling them to do. And also, this is a palatable presentation to Jews and Israelis, because it doesn't invoke the often odd end times fixation on death and destruction, including possibly the death and destruction of a lot of Jews, depending on who you talk to from the more dispensationalist side. And this is a much more positive, action-oriented way of rallying around the cause. And so these things can coexist. You can be a dispensationalist and believe in the blessing theology of Genesis 12:3, though because of the weird history of this, that has not always been the case. There are a lot of dispensationalists, certainly historically, who were dispensationalists but were not Pentecostal. But today, it's just overwhelming. The Pentecostal leadership, it's sort of across the board. Pentecostals lead all of the Christian Zionist organizations today. And then numerically, by far, the global South has far more Christian Zionists than the global North. Now, places like the United States still matter a lot because of the geopolitical significance of the U.S. to the state of Israel. But in terms of numbers, Christian Zionists in the U.S. are sort of a middling population compared to some of these other countries. So that's it's just this is where the history matters, because if you were just to take today's movement and just project it back, it would be a weird way to try to understand the history, because the origins are not Pentecostal and they're not in blessing theology, but they happen, they develop that way over time.
And you see the development or the growth of the influence of charismatic or Pentecostal way of thinking happening with what you call the shoots of 67 afterwards. Is there a connection between the Israeli complete control of the land and prosperity way of thinking about Israel?
Yes, there is, though it's not necessarily dependent on what's happening in Israel. I mean, that's largely a story of American religion and politics, and how the 70s become this decade where there's more and more organization on the Christian right, or what becomes the Christian right. And Pentecostals, primarily because of their numbers, but also because of their advocacy, become really important leaders in that. And if you just did the religious history, Pentecostals tend to be marginalized, even from evangelicals and fundamentalists, going all the way back to their founding in the early 20th century. And it's really in the 70s that there's a reemergence of Pentecostalism on the political stage. And it happens to coincide with a very important decade in Middle East history as well, where Israel is seemingly fulfilling prophecy after the 1967 war. And this is activating a lot. Pat Robertson tells his own story. He's really activated after the 67 war because he thinks that is a fulfillment of certain prophecies in Luke and Revelation. And so he becomes more interested in that topic. And another really important thing that happens in the 70s is because because Israel now controls so much more of the area, the tourism to Israel now includes a lot of what is stereotypically biblical lands, right? So before 67, many of the traditional biblical lands were under the control of Jordan, and were not usually accessible, or it was more difficult if you were an American to sort of go there. After 67, you can take these tours of modern Israel that seemingly show the fulfillment of the prophecy that Israel now controls all these areas from Nazareth to the Old City in Jerusalem, all the way down to the Sinai, at least for the 70s. And this is really striking to a lot of evangelicals and Pentecostals. And most of the leaders of the Christian Zionist movement in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s take their first tour of Israel of this sort of post-67 tour in the 70s. And almost to a person, they will reference that tour when they talk about how they became interested in this issue. They will reference the tour they took that sort of brought this certain narrative of what was happening in Israel alive to them. And then they go back home and then become very activated. And that's true for Robertson. That's true for Jerry Falwell. That's true for John Hagee, who's still sort of the most significant leader. They all took tours in the 70s, and this is one of the most important things. So I spent some time in my research thinking about the tourism and how that tourism really does try to enforce a certain ideological interpretation of the region, and then also line up with these theological commitments as well.
And tourism continues to be a very powerful tool that is used by Christian Zionists to be blunt, to brainwash Christians into seeing this narrative of fulfillment of prophecy, of God's faithfulness, and go see the Megiddo and see the end times kind of prophecy being fulfilled here on this field that you're looking at right now. And of course, I have to center this issue, which is that the Palestinian Christians, the Palestinian story is absent. I want to talk with you about this for our Patreon supporters, about the Palestinians and where they fit in all of this. But for sure, tourism has been a double-edged sword for us because, one, we are invisible to our siblings in the faith who come and they want to see the church, they want to see the churches, they want to see all the sites, and of course they ignore us. But also, secondly, tourism has been also very important for the Christian communities because of financial support. That tourism, especially into Bethlehem, my hometown, where I'm from, rely heavily on this. So it's like you want it to happen by Christians, especially from the US, because they have a lot of money and they like to shop. But at the same time, it's part of this very problematic, honestly, like sinister system that is intentionally ignoring and silencing Palestinians. And so this has been happening, like you're saying, from the 70s, and it still has a very powerful role today in mobilizing Christian Zionists, the average church member, to be pro-Israel. So that begins in the 70s, and you're seeing this kind of growing there. What happens afterwards? I think you identify the branches to be from 76 to 2018. At least this is because of your book. So how is that different? How is that changing? But I'm guessing there's a lot of continuity between the 70s and until today, right? So what's happening in the branches?
I think the biggest shift is the actual leadership of the Christian Zionist movement, which really is still, even into like the mid 70s, is still quite a small movement. We're not talking about anything close to what comes after. But you see a big leadership change. So we've already talked about Billy Graham. He's by far the most important evangelical from the 40s to the 70s. He is not for both Israelis, for Israelis, for some American Jewish activists, and for other evangelicals. Graham is not sufficiently pro-Israel enough. I mean, this is and part of that is Graham's own profile. Like, this is one issue of hundreds of issues that Graham cares about, and so he's not dedicating enough time to it. He's also not fully bought into either a dispensationalist understanding of Israel or a Pentecostal understanding of Israel. And so there are some interesting, and Billy Graham's a very interesting figure, but if you go back and read in the 80s, he actually came out, against, he was for the nuclear freeze movement. He had just sort of an interesting politics that didn't line up with the Christian right as it was emerging. And so Graham really is sidelined from this movement in the late 70s. And because of some deaths and other things, so are the other evangelical leaders who really started this movement as sort of this side, sort of fringe thing, and who comes in. And this is what I really wanted to explain is like when someone like Jerry Falwell comes in the late 70s, this independent Southern Baptist minister who really doesn't know the first thing about Israel. He has some famous quotes about he really was anti-Semitic as a young person. How does he within a year or two become totally bought in to Christian Zionism and totally bought into making that one of his major platforms for the moral majority, which he founds and then leads throughout the 80s. And so for me, the prehistory to someone like Falwell is like explaining how someone like that can sort of become integrated into the movement so quickly that you really only need like a year of orientation to really buy into it. And so, this is the big change is Falwell comes in the U.S. side, and we have the major election in Israel in 1977 that brings in for the first time a right-wing government, and Menachem Begin becomes the first non-labor prime minister of Israel. And the ideological sort of clarity of the movement really amps up at that point. And so there's a clear sense from both the American Christian side and the Israeli side that settlements are in, that the West Bank should not even be referred to as the West Bank. It should be referred to as Judea and Samaria, the biblical names for this land that Israel controlled. That basically what's happening in the Middle East more broadly is a religious civilizational war between the Judeo-Christian bloc and the Muslim bloc. This is one of the main framings of the Lebanon War in 1982, and really one of the only supporters of that war, of the Israelis in that war, from the American side are the Christian right. Even the Reagan administration is condemning what's happening, but it's the Christian right that has sort of got Begin's back when it comes to the media, when it comes to sort of adjudicating this in public. And that ideological clarity really sort of continues through the 80s and 90s, though at various points, because of Israeli politics, they are fighting from the outside of power rather than the inside. So the Christian right is quite skeptical of the Oslo peace process in the 90s. And they're really skeptical because they see any type of Israeli attempt to trade land for peace as basically going against what they expect to be the ultimate land claims of the state of Israel. Now, this is controversial because there's another faction within the Christian Zionist world that thinks you should really just always follow the Israeli leadership, and you should not be trying to critique them. That just sort of undermines the movement, and that side is quite important too. And actually, John Hagee, who becomes the most significant Christian Zionist of the 21st century, is someone who has deep reservations theologically about Yitzhak Rabin's even negotiating with Yasser Arafat, but also publicly says we should keep those private because the bigger goal here is to support Israeli politicians, no matter what they're essentially doing, because they know what's best for them. And that ideological clarity sort of really then pays off in the more recent era where Netanyahu has been in power for so long and has really, overseen a succession of right-wing governments in Israel, and has made Christian Zionism or the sort of Christian relations such a major part of Israeli foreign policy. And it was always that way to some extent. Going back to the 50s, the Israeli government understood that they needed to conduct public diplomacy with the Christian world as they understood it. But there was not a sense of like, what are the actual ways we're going to galvanize support? A lot of that early public diplomacy was defensive. It was trying to make sure that Christians didn't have a sort of prejudice against Jews or against Israel. Once you get a right-wing, consistent right-wing leadership in Israel, and once you get a very consistent right-wing leadership in the Christian Zionist movement, you start seeing a much more collaborative and you could say aggressive or activistic sense of that way of relating to each other. And one way to see this is outside of Christians Unite for Israel, which is the biggest lobby group in the U.S. They're headquartered in D.C., supporting pro-Israel policies. Almost every other major Christian Zionist organization is headquartered in Jerusalem. And the people who run it, many of them have lived in Israel for decades at this point. And so they're very much part of the political culture there. They're very much on friendly terms with Israeli politicians from across the spectrum. And this is something I wrote about last year for New Lines magazine, just appreciating the professionalization of the movement. I think a lot of people still see the movement as grassroots and populist and apocalyptic. And at this point, it's anything but that. It's actually a well-run, well-financed machine that is now in its second or third generation of leadership and is very savvy to the Israeli political culture and to the U.S. political culture, and then increasingly to the ways that Christian Zionism connects with political cultures in the global South as well.
And just to give a survey of the field, so Jerry Falwell, you mentioned him. Now you have, his son, he fell from grace, but Liberty University continues to be influential. I don't know how much of that theology continues at the university, but it's very conservative, so you would assume that it would. Billy Graham passed away, but his son, Franklin, is very pro-Israel, a very Christian Zionist. And John Hagee continues to be a pillar, if you will, of Christian Zionism through Kufi. And there are many organizations, the Christian Embassy in Jerusalem and otherwise televangelists. I don't know how much power they have right now. God TV and Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, I think very clearly Zionist. So they have a very still today, an overwhelming kind of cultural, popular Christian influence. But also there is the Trump administration, which, you published your book in 2019, he was still in office. But then we see this, right? This is perhaps the apex of the Christian rights, or at least the Christian Zionist political power. You have very clearly open Christian Zionists in the administration. You have the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, which, as I recall, for many of them, it happened in 2017, which coincides with the 50th anniversary of 67. And for them, there was some kind of prophetically significant symbolism there. I think John Hagee, mentioned that, or someone else. So do you see this as an important moment here in the Trump administration and the power of the Christian Zionist kind of political lobby?
Yeah, I definitely do. And you could add to the list you just had Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Dallas.
He was at the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, and he's consistently been one of Trump's biggest defenders in Fox News and so forth. And in some ways, we'll see things. There's always chances for things to even get more crazy, but the Trump administration was really the apex of the Christian Zionist movement so far. And that's not just because it got some of its long-term policy goals, like the embassy move across. It was also that someone like Mike Pence is probably the highest ranked Christian Zionist in the sense of a full-throated, he could articulate, if you just quizzed him on the theology, he would be very firm on it.
Right.
People there have been plenty sort of cultural Christian Zionists, people like George W. Bush and so forth. But I don't think Bush could have ever articulated a clear theology of the nation of Israel. Mike Pence was quite versed in that,
And Pompeo as well, I think he was.
And Pompeo is also quite significant. Another, to go back, John Ashcroft would have been one, the attorney during the Bush years, but he wasn't really involved in foreign policy or something like that. There have been other people in power who have had Christian Zionist, theological Christian Zionist convictions. Famously, Reagan wasn't a very clear thinker on this, but he read The Late Great Planet Earth, the famous book from the 70s. He, at various points, speculated on the end of the world being, somehow tied up with prophecy. But these were also the offhanded remarks or reflections of someone who we just know from other sources, wasn't like a theological thinker. Reagan wasn't really thinking through these things systematically. But Pence was, and Pompeo certainly gave off that impression as well. And then there's also the role of of CUFI's yearly summit. Every summer they have a summit in DC, and it's just been remarkable to see in the 2020 cycle for elections. And then the 2024, or I guess 2023 primary cycle, how important making a visit to CUFI's annual meeting has been for Republican politicians. It's been, I mean, if you just look at the last few years of their keynote speakers, it's basically the leadership of the Republican Party, whether they're Trump or Nikki Haley or various, Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. I mean, all these people make the stop, and that's a big signal too that this becomes CUFI, and then basically your view on Israel becomes a baseline requirement to be considered viable for president, at least, or for certain Senate offices as well. That was never the case before. I mean, there's definitely been periods in the past where AIPAC and other pro-Israel organizations have really made it tough on local elections, even on national elections. And plenty of people have showed up at AIPAC conferences before. But it's been remarkable just seeing how quickly CUFI, which was only founded in 2006, not even 20 years old at this point, has become just sort of central to Republican politics. And part of that is because CUFI claims to have over 10 million members. If you think all 10 million of those members are going to somehow vote in part based on their view on Israel, that's a really powerful voting bloc. That's about as many American Jews as there are total in the United States. So you're claiming a vast majority. It's a slice of the evangelical world, but a very large group of people for this cause. I'm dubious that there's actually 10 million sort of active members, but certainly they represent millions of people, and that's important to take note of. So, the Trump administration really saw the heights of this. In some ways, you can still see the power of the movement because of even when they're out of power, even when their preferred politician is out of power, there is a definite limit to what Republicans can do to criticize any U.S. policy toward Israel that, at least from a position that there should be less done to support Israel. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. Democrats have this same dynamic for different reasons. But certainly one of the most important ones for any current Republican politician is taking note of the CUFI bloc, and then locally, if you're a senator or somewhere else, certainly if you're in Florida or Texas, or one of the other Sunbelt states, this is going to be a major issue on the state level. And that's something we don't talk often about, but CUFI is very active on the state level. There's been a lot of state level sort of rejections of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement that have been organized by CUFI. And that's another expression of their power that doesn't have direct effect on the State Department's policy, but does have a broader effect on U.S. relations with Israel.
Yeah, right. And I do remember at some of the CUFI's, one of their summits, they pushed for, I think, a defunding of UNRWA or something like this.
Sure.
And lo and behold, the Trump administration defunded UNRWA. It's like they actually have such significant power and had over Trump. And I'm guessing they continue to have that. We're running out of time, but maybe this is the question that I would kind of finish with. Obviously, this is troubling for me and for others to see the power of Christian Zionism today. You're a historian; you don't speak about the future per se, but how do you understand, like, from the signs we're seeing today? This is an election cycle now. How do you understand the persistent, if any, kind of power of Christian Zionism in American policy and politics? Trump, I'm not going to expect Trump to change in how he caters to Christian Zionists. He made statements about Jews. If you vote for Democrats, you hate yourself. You need to vote for me. So he understands that his position is a very important position when it comes to the support of the state of Israel. But also, you note significantly, there's dispensationalism isn't as important. I think prosperity gospel and Pentecostal thinking is not as significant among many evangelicals, at least as I understand it. How do you, if you can anticipate the next few years of Christian Zionism, political activism, how do you see that happening? Or what do you see it declining, or do you see more power and influence for Christian Zionism today?
I mean, there will be persistence no matter who wins the U.S. election because of the close relationship between Christian Zionists and the Israeli government. And so that's a part of the relationship that's not totally, I mean, it's influenced by U.S. elections, but it's not dependent on them. I think if Trump is the next president, you're going to see a reemergence of what was happening in the first administration, in part because this is one of the main wins, you could say, for Trump with his base, and he's going to go back to that if given the chance. So I would expect prominent appointments of people who are coming out of the CUFI world in various foreign policy positions if Trump is elected. If Trump is not elected, I anticipate. Well, I don't even want to predict that because it totally depends on what's happening in the Middle East. But I anticipate CUFI is not going away. CUFI will be sharpening its critique. I'm guessing, based on CUFI's past, that while Israel and support for Israel is its core issue, it also has other issues around Iran and other things that will probably flare up, again, dependent on what's happening in the region. And then
I know that CUFI, sorry to interrupt, I know CUFI has been pushing for a war with Iran, I think.
Yes. I mean, it was founded in 2006, largely in response to the tension with Iran.
With Ahmadinejad, right.
Yeah, with Ahmadinejad and the Iranian nuclear program and everything like that. So, yeah, that's been since the beginning. That's been a core dynamic. The last thing I'll say is on the U.S. front, there really is, and there's more polling that came out this year on this, there really is a crisis in generational enthusiasm about this among evangelicals, Pentecostals, fundamentalists, all of them, no matter how you categorize them. Younger American Christians are not nearly as default supportive of Israel as their parents. And by younger, it's basically millennial and Gen Z Christians is the sort of break off point. And it's stunning just to see how different the polling goes. Now, polling can change. People can get older and adopt the views of their parents and so forth. But we haven't seen this in earlier generations. And what you're seeing now is basically a 50-50 split on sympathy for the Palestinian perspective or the Israeli perspective on the conflict. And then even more than that is a lot of apathy about the topic in general. Now, that might have changed in the last year. It's been in the news a lot more, and polling wouldn't necessarily reflect that yet. But up until the most recent polls, the biggest change from, say, an evangelical who's 30 and an evangelical who's 60 is the 60-year-old really cared about this issue. Like they prioritized it. They thought it was really important. It says something about a politician where they stood on this issue. And for younger evangelicals, that just appears not to be the case. And there's a lot of reasons why people have bandied about why that's the case. One of them could be the decline in dispensational theology, meaning this sort of special role of Israel is like just not there in the day-to-day, week-to-week preaching. And so it's just not part of younger evangelicals' ways of thinking about Christianity. We also know that contra to prophecy or other framings of issues, now the main framing for a lot of young evangelicals is justice, is sort of the organizing principle. In that framing, Palestinians take on a much more added significance because of their plight, because of the longevity of the injustice that they've suffered. That this now becomes a much more of an important issue on a justice front than it would have ever for older evangelicals as well. And so for whatever reason, younger evangelicals are much less enthused about this. And the people who know this best are people like at CUFI, who are wondering in 10, 20 years, when their oldest members are aged out, who's going to be who are they going to represent? Who's going to fund them? And I think this is a huge crisis. I say that neutrally, just like looking at it, like this would be a crisis if any organization was going through this. And it's really unclear to me 20 years from now, who's leading who's leading the Christian Zionist organizations, and who are they actually speaking for? It could be a much smaller segment of evangelicalism, and it could be one that is much less politically relevant than the one that is now. That's one scenario. It's one that I think the polling's really showing is a likely one. But of course, things can also change in the meantime as well. But that's a really important factor. And it's different than the global scene, where it's almost the opposite, which is there's a lot of growth potential for Christian Zionism in other countries. But when we look at the unique way that religion is playing out in the U.S., particularly among generations of white evangelicals, you just see a big shift. And I think that's something to always keep in mind is you're hearing John Hagee or others sort of claim to speak for X number of millions of people. It may not matter right this moment, but like, how old are those people and where are they actually located? And is that a movement that's actually got legs for the future, or is it one that will decline in the next few decades? And I think that's an important story that we'll just have to see how it goes.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you're underplaying the role of apocalyptic theology in Christian Zionism, but sadly, the image you draw for us is very apocalyptic when it comes to Christian Zionist support. But there's a glimmer of hope among younger generations, which I'm also cheering for to see that happen. I think for you to ground justice as a pivotal kind of motivator for those young Christians, I think is hugely important, and we need to keep kind of emphasizing that, and especially going back, we didn't talk about the Bible and Christ per se, but to emphasize the centrality of Christ and the Gospels and the way we think about it. But also at the same time, Dan, you have organizations like the Philos Project, the Israel Collective, which is, I think, is a branch of Kufi trying to target young evangelicals, Passages and others. They are trying to reach out to millennials and others. So we cannot underestimate their power and their reach, and also their financial kind of resources that help them. Anyway, we have to end at this. This is a very fascinating conversation. Appreciate the work you're doing. For sure, I'm pretty sure you're gonna continue this work, because there's always evolving developments in Christian Zionism and American policy. So very grateful for the work you're doing. Please stick around with me. I want to talk with you about something else for our Patreon supporters. But Dan, this has been fantastic. Appreciate the work you're doing. Thanks for doing this interview.
It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.